Hey everybody, ever struggle with fitting door or window trim when there's barely any space between the door jamb edge and the wall? It's a common issue in older homes and many of the remodels that I encounter where a tight fit can throw off the balance and design of your trim that you're using. Today I'll show you a pro tip to solve this problem and still get a clean, polished look without sacrificing style. In the project that I was doing here, we were working with 3.5-inch wide Winsor casing, but when the available space on one side is only 3 inches and the other side is even tighter at 2.5 inches, a full 3.5-inch wide trim just won't cut it. No pun intended. Stick around and I'll walk you through a smart, site-made solution using custom poplar casing and precise techniques for a perfect fit, even when the space is tight. So trimming Winsor casing to fit could result in noticeable inconsistencies in balance, right? Making the trim look unbalanced, but also lose a lot of its details. It looks choppy. To address this, I decided to use 3/4 poplar, just flat stock, and route a 3-inch bead on the router. The bead replicates the Winsor casing bead and complements the trim throughout the house. It's a subtle but refined solution for trimming out areas with the space constraints, closets or tight areas. I set up a job site router with a fence and featherboard to create this trim. The featherboard helps maintain the tight hold against the router's bearing bit while I ensured my hands kept a downward pressure on the table. So let's talk about fitting the vertical trim. That's the first step. And I first make 3/16 reveal marks on the jamb sides and on the top. I make these marks low on the floor at the midpoint and at the top corner. And the reason for these marks is that's where I'm going to set my trim back to. It's a very common trim thing that we do for setting trim on windows and doors. And you don't try to create your trim flush, you try to go back and create a reveal. So we're going to use a 3/16 reveal. And I just mark those all the way around. Then I measure the distance from the wall to the marks that I just made and compare them to check for any irregularities in the wall. Look, it's rare that you're going to find a perfectly plumb wall. You're probably going to have to do some sort of a scribe. It could be a straight scribe, it could be all over the place. So what I do next is I rip my trim board to that largest measurement that I took, and I hold it plumb against the wall. I use a level to ensure the trim is plumb vertically. And then I rip that board, I make sure that I rip it at a 10-degree bevel. I like using the 10-degree bevel on the trim board because it creates a point that touches the wall and goes back away from the rounded corner of the plaster and ensures a tighter trim fit to the wall. Once plumb, I scribe the gap and then I cut the scribe either on a table saw using that same 10-degree bevel or hand plane it or whatever I need to do. After test fitting, I fine tune the scribe, and I'll probably use a hand plane for the fine tuning just to get a perfect fit. I follow this process on both sides and then mark and cut my top miters to fit in place. I want to make sure that you understand that once we have this scribed, your trim lines or your vertical trim should be lined up with your 3/16 reveals that you made. Okay, let's talk about fitting the top casing now on top of the window or the door. The top casing is going to remain 3.5 inches wide for now. It can be reduced slightly for aesthetics if you need to, just so you have a more balanced look. Due to the uneven walls, the top miters will need customization. They're not going to just be 45 miters. The left side will be a miter with a 90-degree square cut on it, so it's custom. On the right side, in this particular case, will just be a miter. So to do that, I first measure my short-to-short measurement of the miters and I write it down. Then I measure my total wall-to-wall distance, and then I'll measure from my left side short point up to where my miter is. And that's going to give me the point where I need to make my 90-degree cut. These measurements and that wall-to-wall distance are all going to help me locate this square cut. So I'll bring the trim to the saw. I first make that left side 45-degree miter cut on the 3.5-inch trim board. Then I mark the square cut. And I set the saw to 90 degrees and make that cut. In this case, it was about 1 1/16 or something. So I measured down and made that cut. Afterwards, I measured the short to short point, mark that, and cut the 45-degree cut on the right side. Once everything fits well, I glue both miters, nail the top casing to the wall in in the door jamb and finish nailing off my trim. I'll use a finish nailer into the studs and the header, and I'll use a brad nailer through the bead into the jamb of the door. Just makes for a better connection so that you get that nice and tight. To keep the miter tight, you may have to play with it a little bit. Sometimes I use a shim, or oftentimes I'll even wedge in with a little bit of a bevel cut, a piece of wood against the ceiling, or with a shim to protect the ceiling and a piece of wood, and push down and put some pressure clamping on the miter just until the glue dries. So to conclude, this method allows for a more precise and aesthetically pleasing trim installation in tight spaces where walls or other obstructions limit standard casing width. By customizing the trim and adapting the miters, it's possible to maintain consistency with existing trim styles. So the bead that we chose kind of complements and matches our Winsor trim. And it ensures a professional finish in challenging situations. Guys, I hope you found this video helpful. Please click the like button, leave us a comment, and of course, please consider subscribing and click the notification bell. It helps our channel grow, and we appreciate your support. I'm Rob Robles. We'll see you next time. Take care.